You often hear about Rwanda, don't you? Usually framed as this uh, great African economic success story, the miracle, they call it.
That's the common narrative, yes. A real poster child, supposedly.
Well, today we're planning to, dig a bit deeper, look beyond that surface, thanks to some really interesting material shared with us.
Exactly. It's crucial to get past the headlines sometimes, and the specific source we're diving into today is Rwanda's economic collapse, the high price of plundering Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. It's by René Claudel Mugenzi.
René Mugenzi, right. And his piece paints a dramatically different picture, doesn't it? It really challenges that whole economic miracle idea.
It absolutely does. And our focus here is really on understanding his analysis, René Mugenzi's assessment. He's looked at the data, he's looked at the context.
He seems to have really synthesized a lot of information. What's his main argument then, the core idea?
Well, René Mugenzi's central point is basically that this celebrated growth, it's just not sustainable. He argues it's built on, let's say, shaky pillars.
Shaky pillars like...
Like ongoing foreign aid, for one. Then there's a system he describes as benefiting political insiders, cronyism, and crucially, the exploitation of resources from the neighboring DRC.
Okay, so aid, elite benefit, and DRC resources. That's the foundation, according to René Mugenzi.
That's the core of his critique, yes, that these are propping up the system, not genuine internal transformation.
And you get the feeling reading his work that René Mugenzi isn't just guessing. He's basing this on reports, data.
Oh, absolutely. He appears to be drawing from various sources. You'd assume things like IMF reports, World Bank data, maybe credit rating agency assessments, possibly even official Rwandan figures, though he's obviously interpreting them differently.
That synthesis is key. So how does René Mugenzi start building his case? What's the initial evidence he points to?
Well, right away, René Mugenzi flags some, let's call them warning signs from the financial world. He talks about recent credit ratings, Fitch ratings, for example.
Fitch, what did they say?
In October 2024, they kept Rwanda's rating at B+. But, and this is what René Mugenzi likely focuses on, they also noted some serious concerns.
Like what?
Things like low GDP per capita, persistent deficits, both budget and trade, and significantly rising government debt. So even within that B+ rating, there were red flags.
Red flags that seem to align with René Mugenzi's longer-term perspective. And wasn't there another rating agency action shortly after?
Yes, Moody's. In March 2025, René Mugenzi would definitely have picked up on this. Moody's actually revised Rwanda's outlook to negative.
Negative outlook. Why? What reasons did they give that support, René Mugenzi's analysis?
They specifically mentioned the conflict in eastern DRC, which is central to René Mugenzi's argument about resource exploitation and the potential fallout.
Fallout like less aid, tourism dropping.
Precisely. The risk of reduced foreign aid and fewer tourists because of the instability in Rwanda's alleged role. So René Mugenzi uses these external assessments to really reinforce his points about the economy's vulnerability.
And that DRC involvement. René Mugenzi really digs into that, doesn't he? He links Rwanda's actions there directly to economic consequences.
And he does. He points out that Rwanda's alleged backing of the M23 rebels has led to serious international pushback. We're talking sanctions or threats of them from major players, the US, UK, Germany, the EU.
How does he connect that foreign policy choice to, the economic bottom line?
René Mugenzi draws a very clear line. He details the impacts. For instance, the UK partially suspending aid, Germany actually halting new financial commitments altogether as of March 2025.
Wow, halting new commitments, that's significant.
It is. And then you have the EU imposing targeted sanctions in March 2025 on specific Rwandan officials. Why? For their alleged involvement in extracting DRC resources. This directly backs up René Mugenzi's claim about the economic motives and the resulting costs.
So, according to René Mugenzi, this foreign policy is now actively damaging the economy it was perhaps intended to bolster.
That's exactly his argument. And he's been saying variations of this for a while, apparently.
Right, this isn't a new stance for him.
No, René Mugenzi even mentions an article he wrote almost 10 years ago called "The so-called Rwandan Economic Miracle is a Mirage." So his analysis has been consistent over time.
A mirage, huh? Strong words. Did he have evidence back then, too?
He cites, for instance, the World Bank's 2014 economic update. Even back then, the World Bank noted Rwanda had failed to stimulate a significant transformation of its economy.
Yeah, well, to transform.
Yeah.
Despite the narrative.
Exactly. And it highlighted the continued heavy reliance on a large public sector funded primarily by, guess what, foreign aid. Rene Mugenzi uses this history to argue that the fundamental structure hasn't really changed.
Which brings us back to aid dependency. That's a recurring theme in Rene Mugenzi's analysis.
A central one. He looks at the numbers. Aid was about $1.07 billion in 2022, down from $1.33 billion the year before.
A drop sounds good, no. Less dependent.
Well, not necessarily, according to Rene Mugenzi's interpretation. He points out a shift happening within that aid. Less in grants, more in loans, both concessional and, worryingly, commercial loans.
Ah, so the debt burden is increasing, even if the total aid figure dipped slightly.
Precisely. And Rene Mugenzi highlights projections, like from the IMF, expecting Rwanda to pay around $42 million just in debt servicing between February and December 2025 alone.
$42 million in less than a year. Ouch.
And it fits into a bigger picture. Fitch forecasted the public debt to GDP ratio could hit 78.2% by 2025. That's getting very high. It all points towards the debt spiral Rene Mugenzi warns about.
And then there's the currency issue. Rene Mugenzi must see the Rwandan franc's depreciation as a major problem here, too.
Absolutely critical. He emphasizes the scale the franc basically lost 100% of its value against the US dollar between 2015 and 2025. It went from around 708 RWF per dollar to 1,430.
Doubled. That's huge.
Huge. And that decline has apparently accelerated since 2022. What does that do? It makes servicing all that foreign currency debt much, much more expensive. Plus, it fuels inflation because Rwanda imports a lot. Rene Mugenzi weaves all these threads together.
Okay, so debt, aid shifts, currency devaluation. What about the internal engine, the private sector? You'd expect that to be thriving and a miracle. What does Rene Mugenzi's research show there?
Well, his analysis suggests it's quite weak, actually, or at least highly concentrated. He likely looked at data, maybe a 2019 report, that showed something pretty startling.
What was that?
That just 0.4% of taxpayers, a tiny fraction, were responsible for over 91% of the country's total tax revenue.
0.4% paying 91%. That's incredibly skewed.
It signals a massive vulnerability, doesn't it? And Rene Mugenzi probably also considered things like the labor force survey from 2023. It found over 90% of employed people are in the informal sector.
90% informal, so subsistence farming, small, unregistered businesses.
Exactly. Rene Mugenzi argues this ongoing reliance on the informal economy and basic agriculture just doesn't square with the narrative of a modern, transformed economic miracle.
So, if the private sector isn't the main driver, what is, according to Rene Mugenzi? He talks about crony capitalism, right, and something called Crystal Ventures.
Yes, CVL Crystal Ventures Ltd. Rene Mugenzi positions this entity, which is essentially the business arm of the ruling party, as central to the whole system.
How so? What's their role in his analysis?
Rene Mugenzi likely analyzed how CVL seems to dominate key economic sectors, everything from construction and agriculture to telecoms and security. He suggests they get preferential treatment.
Preferential treatment like?
Yeah.
Easier access to big government contracts. Maybe funding?
That's the implication in his analysis. Privileged access to contracts, possibly even tapping into Social Security funds. Rene Mugenzi portrays it as creating a rent-seeking system where the primary benefits flow to a select few with political connections rather than fostering broad-based growth.
Okay, and what about infrastructure? We often see pictures of new buildings, roads in Kigali. Does Rene Mugenzi address that?
He does, but again, he urges looking beyond the surface visuals. He uses indicators like electricity consumption per capita.
Electricity. How does that measure up?
According to figures he likely examined for 2022, Rwanda's per capita electricity consumption was really low, about 64.9 kilowatt.
How low is that compared to elsewhere?
Significantly lower than both the African average and, obviously, the global average. Rene Mugenzi uses data like this to argue that despite the image of modernity, basic development in crucial areas like energy access hasn't kept pace. It challenges the technologically advanced nation image.
So, if we tie all these threads together, from Rene Mugenzi's perspective, the DRC involvement, the aid dependency, the debt, the weak private sector, the cronyism, the infrastructure gaps.
Yeah.
What's the ultimate conclusion he reaches?
His core argument, really, is that the big gamble, the involvement in the DRC, perhaps initially seen as a way to grab resources and boost the economy, has ultimately backfired. Badly.
Backfired how? It didn't bring the expected economic windfall.
Not only did it likely not deliver as hoped, according to Rene Mugenzi, but it triggered all this negative international reaction, the sanctions, the aid cuts, the diplomatic isolation.
And that has direct financial costs.
Exactly. Rene Mugenzi emphasizes the cost of the military operations themselves, plus the economic damage from the sanctions and reduced aid. He argues it's making Rwanda's already shaky financial situation even worse. It's deepening the problems, not solving them.
So, to wrap up Rene Mugenzie's overall assessment, based on his detailed look at all these factors, he's essentially saying the African economic lion story is falling apart.
That's a fair summary of his viewpoint, yes. He argues the model is collapsing under the pressure of too much debt, a falling currency, less reliable aid, and consequently, fading investor confidence. He meticulously connects the dots using available data and geopolitical analysis.
So the main takeaway then from Rene Mugenzie's work, the point he really hammers home, is that this widely praised Rwandan economic miracle,
Hmm.
well, when you scrutinize it using his analysis, it looks built on very, very fragile ground.
It certainly makes you think, doesn't it? And it raises broader questions based on Rene Mugenzie's findings. Like, what does this tell us about relying too heavily on headline growth figures?
Or maybe about how much we should discount the role of, say, foreign policy and regional peace when we talk about long-term economic health. Rene Mugenzi really links those tightly.
Absolutely. He shows how intertwined they are.
It leaves you with a lot to consider. Thinking about Rene Mugenzie's analysis, the links he draws between aid, debt, conflict, state control, and economic stability, what could the long-term consequences be for Rwanda, and maybe even the wider region, if these issues he identifies aren't tackled?
That's the key question, isn't it? It really underscores the value of digging into analyses like Rene Mugenzie's and considering the different facets of a country's economic story.